Destination Dark Zone, written by Susan May. Narrated by Hollis McCarthy and Steve Marvel. Drift. An evening commuter train departs a city station during a wild and bitter snowstorm. Those aboard are thinking only of arriving home and enjoying a hot dinner. This train, though, will never reach its final destination. On board, 7-year-old Rory is traveling home with his mother. A curious child, he passes the time playing a people-watching game, spying on his fellow passengers, and fantasizing about who they really are behind their facades. When a female passenger catches his attention, he finds himself unable to stop watching her. Maybe it's the annoying buzzing in his head, or the woman's unusual behavior, but there's something not quite right about her. Soon, he'll discover there's something not quite right about this night. In fact, this night is all wrong. In this Troubles Keeper prequel, we meet a young Rory Fine, as yet unaware of his unique ability. Something incredible is about to happen to change the course of his life and the lives of many others. Heroes sometimes come in small but remarkable packages. Prologue. February 4, 1996 would not end as it had begun. This February 4th would be changed. And because of this, all the events following would be intrinsically altered forever. All because of this one day. Well, that was the hope. Part 1. 1. In Chase City, the snow had fallen nonstop for 3 days. Small flurries of dancing flakes whipped wildly around the streets leading to the Palmerston North Station. The peak hour travelers, rushing to climb the steps to their platforms, pulled the lapels of their coats high and tugged them closer about their frozen necks, tightening their hoods and turning their faces toward the ground in a futile attempt to protect themselves from the bitter cold. 7-year-old Rory held tight to his mama's hand as they stood on the platform awaiting their homeward-bound train. Even through the combined thickness of both their gloves, he imagined he sensed the warmth of her skin. Now and then, she'd squeeze his fingers to reassure him he was safe, and that very soon they'd be out of the elements and in a heated car. In the distance, he heard the faint clack-clack of the approaching train. His happiness and relief at the thought they'd soon arrive home made him give a little hop. On the menu tonight was his favorite, spaghetti bolognese. Home also meant a hot bath. Rory so loved throwing off his cold, stiff clothes and sitting there in the luxurious, steamy bubbles as the chill slowly drained from his body. If his mother was in a rush, they'd skip washing his hair, one of his least favorite things anyway. The soap always got in his eyes, and the smell of shampoo sometimes set him off sneezing. Every time he complained, his mother would make a pretend scowl and threaten to have his unruly shoulder-length red locks completely shaved off. He knew she wasn't serious, because moments later she'd smile and say, "Oh, I'm joking, because then all your magical powers would disappear. You know, like what happened to Samson." He wasn't even sure who Samson was, but he thought having special powers seemed very cool, even if he wasn't certain what they might be yet. Often his mama would add, "You have a wonderful heart, my lovely son. Make sure never to change, because the world's a better place because of you. Rory Fine. Fine by name, fine by nature. From the moment you entered the world, son." He wondered how she knew things about his heart. Well, how could she? It was just stuffed away inside, hidden like his favorite meatballs after he'd eaten them. So how did Mama know what his heart could be like? It was impossible. When he placed a hand over his chest, he only felt a faint thump, thump, thump there. Nothing good about that, except it meant he was alive. Being here today was a surprise, because he shouldn't have been accompanying his mother at all. Thanks to his babysitter Carol's emergency, he had the joy of traveling home with his mama. He loved her and he loved train rides, so he was about as happy as Elmo on Sesame Street, maybe even a bit happier. That was why, when his usually sweet mama spoke in her cranky voice about Carol bringing him to his mother's work, it had him quite confused. His mom worked in the mailroom of Colonial Mutual Insurance, situated on the 5th floor of a 40-story gray old building. It was the 5 gleaming elevators, though, that Rory always looked forward to riding whenever he visited. On the rare occasions he found himself there, he thrilled at riding between floors and jumping up and down as the elevator car slowed to a stop. He felt as if he was flying, and the sensation always left him in fits of giggles. Today, he wondered if Samson flew too, but without an elevator. And he hoped, when he grew up, that would be his power. When he and Carol had arrived late in the afternoon, his mama appeared surprised to see them both. Then the flicker of an annoyed face replaced the rounded O of her lips. He thought he'd done something wrong, but as he sat at a desk in a corner, surrounded by packages and letters and piles of paper scribbling away on a large orange envelope, he overheard his mother telling a lady with bright pink lipstick how she didn't believe for a second that Carol's father was sick. Rory watched and listened, wondering what his mother meant by something fishy. When she saw him looking at her, a warm smile replaced her unhappy, knitted eyebrows look. She came over to him and cupped his face in a palm. Sometimes people can be silly and a little thoughtless. Always be thoughtful and kind. Be the one others can count on, okay? You know what I mean? Rory didn't know what she meant at all. He struggled to understand a great deal about the adult world, and had almost given up trying. He hoped he'd learn soon, that the knowledge would just drip from the sky and seep into him as if he was a sponge, no effort required at all, because he didn't want his mama to think him silly or thoughtless. But although Carol may have disappointed his mother, Rory wasn't disappointed in the slightest. Here he was, about to catch a train with his mama, having ridden an elevator up and down, and having managed to jump not once, but twice during the last ride down. So even the terrible weather couldn't take away the happiness bursting inside him, because today seemed like a magical day. Something about it just felt good. Just like his heart. 2. Rory pulled his favorite dark blue beanie further down, so it nestled just above his brow. He leaned out, pulling at his mom's hand to catch sight of the train as it pulled into the station. With the fading light and snow, he saw a monster with a single glowing eye coming right for them. The monster pulled to a stop with a long, anguished screech and rattle, and became, once more, just a train. Rory's mom held his hand even tighter as the doors slid open with a muffled gasp of escaping air. The commuter crowd pushed forward once those departing had alighted, eager to get off a platform offering little shelter from the elements. They hurried onto the train, and Rory felt himself lifted over the threshold in his mother's haste to board. The warmth of the car thawed his cold face and hands almost in an instant. He felt a tingling in his face and reached with his unencumbered hand to wipe at flakes of snow weighing down his lashes. Rory's father had left 2 days before his 4th birthday. In that moment, now so faded in his memory, he still recalled a man with a sad face, crying as he hugged his son. His father had told him to take care of his mother and grow his brave heart, because there was something his father must do alone. Then another image always followed that one. The image of his mother crying and whispering something he couldn't understand, no matter how many times he thought over it. What if we need you more than they do? He wondered always who they were, and what did they need. But he'd been a baby back then, not a big 7-year-old like now. So he couldn't be sure if it was a real memory or something he'd seen on TV. But whenever it slipped into his mind, what he did know was that he felt a sadness creep into his heart. He'd always push it away because he didn't like to feel sad. And he didn't like anyone else to feel sad either. Sadness was not a good feeling. Like many children left to their own devices, he conjured imaginary worlds filled with adventure and heroes. One day, he thought he might go on real adventures, maybe even find his father. Then they'd be a family again, and the sadness he sensed in his mother would go away. So, as he and his mother slid into 2 of the vacant seats facing the aisle, Rory leaned over and whispered, "I love you, Mama." His mama placed her oversized handbag on her lap, smiled down at him, and squeezed his hand for the 2nd time in the last 5 minutes. "I love you too, my sweet boy. You're fine by name and fine by nature. Let no one tell you different." As he returned her smile, Rory caught sight of a girl seated beside Mama. With her purple and blue hair sprinkled with sprays of yellow and red, she looked like one of those parrots he'd seen in a cartoon. She also had a ring through her nose, which made his own nose itchy just by looking at her. She didn't see him because she was reading a book, held up to her face with one hand. Facing across from them, a boy and a girl, who looked about the same age as Carol, his babysitter, held hands. As he watched, they leaned into each other and kissed on the lips for a long, long time, shutting the world out. The kiss lasted long enough for him to wonder if they might run out of breath and turn into statues right there. He was sure they were turning quite pale, starved of breath already. Rory was a people watcher. At least, that was what his teacher, Miss Watson, called him. He'd heard of bird watchers who stared at books and matched birds to pictures. But he didn't know if there were people watcher books. All he knew was there was something fascinating about people's behavior. Other children might find peak hour crowds intimidating, but not him. He could play the story game, noting people as if they were characters in a book, and imagine who they really were, because everyone had an alter ego, just like Superman. Achoo! 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 Just as the doors shushed closed, a man wearing a deep burgundy coat and black baggy trousers leaped aboard. As he did, sneezes exploded from him, and, while still in mid-stride, he pulled out a handkerchief with one hand and blew his nose with a loud honk. While wiping his nose, he tripped and took several running steps down the aisle before sitting himself in an empty seat 2 rows down. He sneezed again, 4 more in rapid succession, before slumping noisily against the window. Bright-colored coat, baggy trousers, and what with all the sneezing and clumsy stumbling, the man reminded Rory of a hapless circus clown. Rory watched the back of the man's head, imagining him whipping out one of those horns clowns squeezed and blowing it at the person behind him. Honk, honk. 2 girls, looking about the same age as his babysitter Carol, sat across the aisle, but up 1 row. One flicked her long blonde hair behind her, as if she was a horse shaking its mane. She cupped a hand over the ear of another blonde girl, this one with a ponytail. Then they both looked over at a man with a big Santa Claus stomach, who wore a gray bomber jacket which seemed stretched beyond its stretching ability. It wasn't nice to laugh at people. Mama always said, "Don't mock those who look different. We're all different." He looked on, as the girls both giggled and covered their mouths with their hands, which did nothing to stifle their laughter. The whole time they continued to glance at the man, who looked back at them and frowned. That made them laugh even more, and Rory decided they were mean, just like Cinderella's wicked stepsisters. A bearded, dark-skinned man with messed hair, a leather jacket, and tight jeans stood by the door. Covering his ears were big, black headphones, their long cord snaking down to a shoulder bag. His head bobbed up and down to a musical beat only he could hear. Rory nodded his head in time with the man's head movements. He was like a parrot in a pet shop he'd seen one time, where the store owner had run his finger up and down in rhythm beside the cage, and the bird had followed each stroke. That was it then. He was Parrot Man, musical superhero. A whistle shrilled from somewhere outside, and Rory swung his gaze, about to peer out the window looking for the station master. That seemed like a good job, except in the snow. He couldn't see the man through the falling whiteness. The train lurched as the brakes released, causing the standing passengers' heads and bodies to sway backward before swinging again forward. They were on their way, and Rory exclaimed a quiet, "Yay," inside. A woman sat next to the kissing couple, still bucking at each other, with silver hair pulled into such a tight bun it seemed to tighten the skin over her jaw into a scissor-sharp line. When she caught him staring, the lady nodded and smiled, as if she'd read his glee at leaving and agreed. Then, still smiling, she looked toward the nodding man and wrinkled her nose as if she had smelled something bad. The wrinkles crisscrossing her face, and deep lines etched sideways down from the side of her mouth to her chin, made her look like the scary witch from Hansel and Gretel. He'd have to be careful of her when he got off the train. Maybe she was hunting children in the snow and was trying to lure him in with her sweet old lady smiles. Now, he imagined how she might make a nice soup of him later if she could only get her hands on him. Rory looked away, not wishing to attract her attention any further. The crackling sound of a newspaper page being turned caught his attention next. 3 rows up, a man in a dark suit and loose tie, which hung about his neck like a necklace, was shaking his newspaper open as he turned a page. He then folded the paper in half and held it out in front of him, half blocking the aisle. Rory noted the jumble of words and dreamed of the day he'd sit on a train or a bus and read anything at all. It all seemed very far off at this moment. Reading wasn't easy. But maybe he could be a bus driver or a train driver. They didn't need to read, did they? Enough of the story game, he thought, feeling the train pick up speed. Nobody was looking at him, and he'd had enough of looking at everyone else. They were all stored in his mind, to use later in stories, he'd tell himself. Rory pulled off his gloves, shoved them in a pocket, and then reached inside his other pants pocket and hunted around. His fingers clasped the cold, smooth outline of a matchbox car. A Chevrolet Camaro slid out, clasped snugly in his palm. He couldn't say the words right yet. Chevrolet Camaro. Chevrolet. The V sound tied his tongue, but he'd been practicing and was almost there. The Camaro bit could come later. "Mama, it's okay if I play with my Chevrolet?" "Yes. Careful, though. Don't drop it." He pulled and pushed the toy up and down the top of his leg, making a vroom vroom noise as he did. That car went everywhere with him, and he no longer possessed legs. Now they were hills and runways to challenge the little vehicle. When the train slowed for the next station, he wasn't even aware several minutes had passed because he'd been racing across green mountains and busy city streets. As the train's brakes squealed, announcing its slowing to enter the station, he was a million miles away, driving his Chevrolet at full speed around a bend. The noise of its brakes screeched and squealed as he made a corner and headed at full speed into a straightaway. People crowded aboard, with only a few exiting here. And when Rory looked up to check who remained of his people, he found his view now somewhat restricted. All he saw, for the most part, were arms and legs, jackets and gloves, and woolly scarves wrapped high and tight around mottled necks, looking more and more like cooked meats. Many people were now standing, and though he felt crowded, it was an opportunity to add more to his story game. He'd have a marvelous adventure to imagine tonight while taking his bath. 3 ladies dressed in skirts and sleek shirts stood in front of him, talking about a movie they'd just seen. Toy Story. Somehow he needed to convince his mama to take him to see it too. They rarely visited the cinema, but he'd seen the posters and ad on TV, and he really, really wanted to watch it. He could almost smell the popcorn, and that thought made him hungry. Then his mind went to dinner, and his tummy growled again. He turned his head to ask his mother how much longer before they were home, but stopped. She was staring across the car past him, and that wasn't usual for her. Staring and gawking is for those who don't have enough sense to know what is their business and what is another's, she'd say. So what was happening here? He followed her gaze as if it was a red laser beam lighting a pathway. It seemed to lead straight to a tall woman who was turning her head this way and that, looking across the passengers as if searching for someone or something. Her stare bounced off each person after lingering a few seconds, but long enough to be more than an accident. Fixed on her face was a mask of deep concentration, just like his mama looked when she was reading bills. Was she counting? Maybe she worked for the railway? Lucky she was standing in a pocket of space, allowing him to see her, the top half of her body framed through the internal window at the end of their seat. Her hair was so black it almost shone purple, and she sported a cropped boy-style haircut, even shorter than his own. Her skin was smooth and white, like the soft inside of an apple. There was something robotic in the way she moved, although it was clear she wasn't a robot. Well, that was obvious. Robots didn't look like pretty women. They were silver and smooth and made of metal. But what she could be... Yes, she could. She could be a scientist. A scientist on this train, here to study people. What about a test to see how many people climbed aboard a train before it became too heavy to move? Had anyone looked into that? If not, then they should, Rory thought. I say 100, he whispered under his breath, smiling to himself because being a scientist who counted how many people got onto a train sounded very interesting. But her clothes didn't look like a scientist's. Tight-fitting dark blue shirt, tucked skin smooth into the top of leather pants. Did scientists wear leather pants? He wasn't sure. He thought they wore white coats. Well, anyway, Rory thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. And, as if she'd heard, she swiveled her neck and her gaze landed upon him. Her head tilted to the left, and he felt magnetized by her blue-like-the-sky eyes. A wisp of a smile touched her lips. Then she dipped her head as if in a silent greeting. Rory considered for a moment if they had met before. He scanned his memory, but found nothing of her. Yet the way she looked at him was like she knew him. He didn't know what made him think this. Maybe it was from all the babysitters he'd had or the way his teachers treated him, but yes, he thought she must know him. She had to know him. It was painted all over her expression. The same kind of look, but without the dread or irritation that sweet Mama's face acquired when she crossed over the street to avoid a tiny woman who talked too much. The one they often encountered in the street when they just wanted to nip out for a quick loaf of bread. That woman who twittered on and on like a bird always showed up in the street whenever they were in a rush, never when they had time to spare. So, yes, this stranger looked at Rory as if she recognized him and they were long acquainted, just the same way Mama eyed the strange bird woman. Warmth spread across Rory's cheeks and neck, and thinking of his Mama's words that he should never stare, he gave her a faint smile. In return, she angled her head again, so it tilted at the opposite angle now. He wasn't sure what to do next, so he returned his attention to his car and ran it up his arm again. But the whole time he felt her watching him. Her eyes seared into the top of his head, so he stayed looking down at his Chevrolet. Rory decided he'd ask his mother about the black-haired woman, but when he looked up to catch her attention, she had her fingertips to her temples and was rubbing there and staring at her lap. Oh dear, Mama must have a headache, he thought. He didn't want to bother her. Maybe she'd seen him staring and he'd upset her. So he went back to his car and wondered if Scientist Lady would turn out to be a goodie or a baddie. Then he felt a hand touching on the top of his head, patting his beanie. His mother was smiling down at him now. No longer rubbing at her own temples, she slipped an arm around him and hugged his body to hers. It was on the tip of his tongue to ask her about Scientist Lady as he gazed up at her from beneath his fringe of curly gold fire locks peeping out from his beanie. But her focus had left him, and now aimed again toward the black-haired lady. He felt crazy little butterflies in his stomach when he saw his Mama's eyes. Rory knew that look, because he'd seen it enough times when he'd hurt himself or was sick. That was his Mama's worried look. Her very worried look. 3. Gail Fine didn't feel her normal kind of tired. Tonight, her body was steeped in deep exhaustion, the kind eating into your bones and wrapping around your spirit. Defeated was one word she'd used to describe it. Days like this made her want to give up, curl into a ball and cry. Just like she had done on that terrible night when it hit her that her Edward was never coming home again. Not ever. She had still clung on to hope back then, even after that day. The plan had been for him to only leave them for a few weeks, a month at the most. But as his absence stretched into a second month without a word, the finality had hit her at 2 a.m. when the cold, empty space beside her screamed out the ugly truth. Now, some 3 years later, she had mostly accepted the finality of it. Yet some days, like today, were worse than others. Edward had promised he'd find his way home or die trying. But what else could she think after those words? What had prevented him? What had stopped him? That's what ate at her. Since she knew in her heart he would never abandon his family, that left only one answer, and she didn't want to think about how that fate had befallen him. He'd known it would be dangerous, and so had she, but there was so very much at stake at the time. So how could she have told him not to go? Although she'd wanted to scream it at him as he turned and walked out the door. But she had the care of their precious child to think about and to fill her mind. Even way back then, they already had known how special he was. So she'd been faced with little choice. Gail glanced at Rory, and a wave of sadness traveled through her. But instead of weighing her down, it filled her with fire to protect her son. He was her life now. And though she'd hoped he'd never face what his father had, she knew she must still prepare him. That was all that mattered. Her own happiness meant nothing, because there was too much at stake. Her husband had once said he and Gail carried the world on their shoulders. Atlas had nothing on them. At least Atlas had known what he'd faced. She had no idea, and that was what kept her awake at night, leaving her perpetually tired, her eyes straining to stay open during the day, and her soul too exhausted to rest even when the darkness fell. As she ran a hand through her shoulder-length auburn hair with its kinks and half-curls she no longer fussed over, she thought, I must get a haircut, as her fingers snagged on several knots. Spoiling herself with hairstyles and makeup was so far from her priority list. Heck, she was lucky to remember to brush her teeth. She only visited the hairdressers when she couldn't stand the mess any longer, and that was about now. Maybe next week, or the one after that. Gail's priority sat right there beside her, and whatever spare time she had left to her, between the full-time clerical job at Colonial Mutual Life and 2 nights a week, sometimes 3 in the cafe, she devoted to Rory. The weekends were free, and that was their time. Theirs once she'd completed the house chores, performed through yawns and little sit-downs before she toppled over. Bless her little Rory, because he would pitch in and help, as much as any 7-year-old could, and had the nature of an angel. Maybe that was God's way of evening out the bad. Evil, she often thought, which had torn their family apart. Looking down at her thoughtful, quiet son, her heart broke. Guilt was never far away in these silly little moments. She couldn't help noticing how Rory had grown quieter over the past year. Guilt seeped into her heart as she pondered if it was his realization he was missing something important in his life, and that no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't give it back to him. The damage of not having a father, and not knowing why, was a heavy, heavy weight for anyone, let alone a small child. Whenever he asked, she told him a half-truth, that he had left to fight for their freedom, and something had happened and he couldn't come home. She prayed she'd never need to reveal the real truth. To the best of her ability, she'd done everything possible to ensure Rory had a sense of security and knew he could at least count on her to be there and to always love him. Gail watched Rory watching their fellow passengers, and she mused if he didn't have more of her husband's DNA than they had first thought. He looked like a perfect porcelain, fiery-haired doll, with his half-smile, perfect, lightly freckled alabaster skin, made even whiter from the cold, and intelligent brown eyes twinkling with curiosity. Oh, my. Just looking at him made her run all the if-onlys. If only she'd said no when Edward had asked her permission to go. If only she'd asked to go with him. If only she'd just thought the whole thing through. She saw her husband sitting there, his 6'2" frame making their kitchen table look like a child's toy, as he awaited her answer. Was that a tear glistening in his eye? Did he want her to say no? Make her the one who stopped him, the one who took the mantle from his shoulders? But how could she have said no, How could she have been selfish when he was so needed, and when he might be the only one who could save them? Yet sometimes anger darkened her heart at his making her the one to choose, making her his accomplice in shattering the life they had, should have had, would have had, if not for the misfortune of being special. This was why she didn't want that for Rory. Being special was dangerous and heartbreaking, and held an unknown future. Gail shook her gaze from her son and surveyed the other passengers in the car. It was a habit of hers, just in case he was there, somewhere among them, looking for them as much as she looked for him. As she did so, without realizing, Gail rubbed a palm up and down Rory's arm, as if feeling delicate silk, in a subconscious move to reassure herself he was still by her side. I'm surrounded by people, and yet so alone. Gail checked her wristwatch. 5:20. Come on, she urged the train, which seemed to be taking forever to leave the station. She needed dinner on the table by 6:15, her son bathed and ready for bed before handing his care to the babysitter. Then it would be a rush across the 6 blocks to Allegro's, the cafe where she worked, to start her shift by 7. When she noticed the black-haired woman staring at Rory, Gail Fine shivered, as a sliver of ice pierced her heart. It couldn't be her. Yet if it was, that must mean something had happened. She turned away and looked down at her lap. She needed to think and to decide what she should do next. But her mind came up blank, because this woman was the last person she'd ever expected or wanted to see again. 4. With a slight jolt, the train pulled from the station. Standing passengers swayed backward with the motion before swinging forward again as if in some synchronized dance. Outside, the storm whipped up a frenzy of snow flurries, and an almost collective silent sigh escaped from those aboard that they were again moving. Who knew if this storm would gather momentum and close stations or lines? Not a single person wanted to be traveling in this mess any longer than necessary. Rory twisted about and stared through the window as towering buildings slipped by, the L train making its giddy loop around the inner city landscape. The streetlights glowed a vague, muted yellow against the dark streetscape which appeared as empty as if the world had ended. Rory looked over at his mother again, who'd returned to wearing the worried look, after replacing it with a brief and fleeting smile, especially for him. Her eyes now seemed as dark as the sky outside, as she moved her head to peer down the car length through the gaps between passengers. He wondered if it was the scientist lady who worried her. He searched for the black-haired woman and saw she was still there, but had moved a little down the aisle. She appeared to continue to search for something, or someone. Rory decided he didn't want the scientist lady to see his mama looking at her. He wanted him and his mama to remain invisible. So he tapped his mother's hand and said, "Mama, how much longer?" He didn't much care about the answer, but it was the first thing which sprang into his mind. His mother tilted her head to the side and stared at him, and Rory was pleased to see her eyes had again changed to become the deep, kind eyes of the person he loved and trusted most in the world. "Hey, sweetheart, you must be real hungry, right?" "No, it's okay. I'm just tired." She pulled off his beanie in a playful way and ruffled his hair, then touched the back of her hand to his face. "Soon, my love, soon. 3 more stations, maybe 10 minutes, if that." Then she pushed his beanie back on his head, pulling it over his ears and kissing the top. He nodded his understanding then glanced toward the scientist lady from just the corner of his eye, so she wouldn't see him looking. To his relief, she had moved even farther away. But because she was so tall, he could still see the top of her head. His gaze traveled back to his mother, who now stared straight ahead, oblivious to her son's concern over a complete stranger. But he still couldn't decide if the woman even was a stranger. Something about her also didn't seem to fit in the scene on the train, like a zebra would stand out among horses. Though she was beautiful to Rory's mind, her hair and clothes weren't all that unusual. Yet there was that unsettled buzzing in his head he'd never experienced before, that he felt had something to do with her. Maybe it was the way she surveyed those around her as if she was hunting, or the strange smile of recognition she gave Rory. Good, he thought, once he knew how many bodies and feet separated them. Still not clear in his mind why it was, in fact, good she was now farther away, or what trouble surrounded the black-haired woman, or why he felt the need to protect his mother from her. Sometimes he didn't understand the way his mind worked. His mama often told him he was special, but whenever he asked why, she'd wrinkle her nose, give him a sweet look, and say, "Because you just are." Rory turned from the scientist lady, but continued glancing over to her every few seconds or so. What could possibly happen among all these people? Soon they'd disembark and leave the strange lady behind, and he'd forget all about her. He would, wouldn't he? Rory resumed driving his little car, but had lost interest. So he drove it up his arm one last time, then down his leg on the way to his pants pocket. He had just parked it snug away when he sensed the train slowing, and not at all at the usual speed, as if pulling into a station. A squealing and shrieking came from below the train. The wheels. The brakes. They had only left the last station a minute ago, and it didn't seem to him they had traveled for long enough to be entering the next, yet brakes were being applied. Rory craned his neck to peer out the window to check if their station lay ahead. It was dark out there, pitch black, a vast cavern of nothingness. Night had fallen, and he couldn't see much of anything, and even the thick, dense blanket of deep white snow appeared black. His mother gasped and swung about to stare out the window too, her arm reaching across to rest in reassurance on his back and shoulder. "What's happening here?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Must be the storm? Problem with the tracks?" Rory couldn't see well enough, so on impulse, he crawled up on the seat to kneel at the window, pressing his nose to the cold glass. He stared out into the bleak night and saw that far below, now just slightly illuminated by hazy street lamps and maybe 25 feet away, lay traffic-heavy, snow-whitened roads of downtown. This part of the L was way above the street, like a bridge. His mother had told him once the city had grown so big 100 years ago, they didn't have room to build underground or along the street, so upward had been the only way to go. Rory had loved traveling so far up, as if on a roller coaster. Not tonight, though, because with this unexpected slowing and the storm outside, he felt vulnerable, and his heartbeat rose just a little. He twisted and craned his neck to look down the length of the outside of the train, and could just make out the rest of the cars snaking around a bend. The train was still moving, but only creeping along, a sluggish caterpillar on tracks. After 20 seconds, it ground to a complete stop, and the horrible screeching of the brakes ceased. Rory had just been about to put his fingers in his ears to stop the sound. Several passengers had already stood and moved toward the door, thinking they'd arrived at the next station. Others gathered newspapers, books, and belongings, stowing them inside bags and pockets, in readiness to alight. Rory looked over at his mother again for a signal they should do the same. But she hadn't moved. She still stared out the window, her brows bunched together in that now too familiar worried look. "What's wrong with the public transportation system?" a high-pitched woman's voice exclaimed from somewhere in the crowd. "I know," replied another woman, whom he couldn't see for all the standing bodies. "We got going. Now what are we waiting for? God, I hope this isn't a breakdown in this awful weather." "This happened last week," replied the high-pitched voice again. "We waited an hour until they came and shunted us to a station, made us get off and catch a bus. This would be crap in the snow. Freeze our tails off, we would." Someone else, another woman, piped up. "Still waiting for my refund from the last time." A male voice interjected. "Transportation system's gone to shit." The mood in the car had descended in an instant to match the darkness lying outside. Rory even imagined a change in the air, heaviness replacing light, sucked clean away. His teacher had only told them last week how everything was made from spinning tiny things you couldn't see. He couldn't remember the name, but he wondered if they were spinning in a different direction now. That was how it felt to him, a change in the air. People began to return to their seats, while others shuffled impatiently where they stood. Even more joined to discuss what the cause of the delay might be, so that it began to sound like a busy classroom, but of adults instead of kids. When a bump rocked the car, the unexpectedness caused a chorus of shocked exclamations from nearly everyone. Those standing found themselves propelled forward at an unexpected speed. Some stumbled over others. One or two were caught and saved by a helping hand, the rest ending up in a heap on the floor, before they immediately scrambled to get back up. A briefcase, held by the nearby businessman with the suit as he stood near the doors, dropped to the ground, making a smacking noise. The girl who'd been kissing the boy across from the man he'd named Briefcase Man reached out to grab a woman who'd stumbled and fallen across her lap. "Oh my God, sorry," the woman exclaimed as she righted herself back to standing with the help of the girl, who replied, "No problem." "Shit," a kid in a school blazer said, as he fell over Briefcase Man's case and tumbled to the floor. Rory knew it was wrong to swear, but if you lost your balance, it might be okay. And Rory was sure he knew the likely cause of the bump and all the swear words he'd heard uttered about him. He'd run his tricycle into walls often enough to recognize the sensation of one solid object colliding with another something or other, also rock hard and immovable. So that was it then. They'd hit something. After the 10 seconds of disruption, a murmur erupted, then nervous laughter. Many leaned over those seated or moved to the doors to peer out the window. Even more wore confused expressions, while a few gave an excited whoop. 3 or 4 passengers rose from their seats a second time, eager to be off the train when it arrived at the station. Rory looked for the dark-haired scientist, curious to know whether she had fallen over. He searched the faces in the crowd, straining his neck this way and that to check if she was lying on the floor or still upright, clinging onto some piece of the train's innards. He couldn't see her. She seemed to have disappeared, which wasn't possible, unless he'd been right and she was a witch. But witches weren't real. Were they? Then a hand was on his arm, clutching tight, causing him to yelp. His heartbeat set off like a rocket, and he had a sudden instinct to get up and run. It was 5:27 p.m. 5. It took Gail less than a heartbeat to realize something was wrong, dangerously wrong. She grasped Rory harder than she'd intended, snaking her arm around his waist and pulling him in close. In disbelief, she watched the floor of the car begin to tilt upward by small degrees, as if the train was climbing a hill. There was no incline here, though. This was flat track, and the train had been stationary until the gentle bump. How were they even moving? Where there had earlier been a buzz of complaints from what everyone presumed would be a delay, now came gasps of surprise. Those standing began to small step along the aisle toward the rear of the car. The degree of the angle was only minimal, but as the seconds moved on, so the angle increased. A few screams echoed, someone crying. A man's voice in a prayer recited, "Our Father," but Gale noticed he got the words all wrong. "Our Father who are in heaven, hallowed to your name," made sense to the man, evidently, but that didn't make it right. It crossed her mind. He wasn't religious, but if you were ever going to bring God into your life, now seemed like a good time for it. When the first person tripped and toppled, it was like a bomb had erupted. Now people were screaming for all they were worth. More people lost their balance and tumbled or tripped over those who had fallen only seconds before. All the time, the floor continued to tilt even more, the car seeming to defy gravity. The man wearing the red jacket who'd sneezed his way onto the train rolled past, his hands clawing out for purchase. Gale would have helped him, but that would have meant letting go of her sweet and precious Rory. The man managed to catch hold of a silvery chair leg and stopped himself, but couldn't maintain his grasp. And 5 seconds later, he continued along his path toward the accruing clump of bodies. Pained screams and shouts invaded the space, a cacophony of terror. The smell of fear emanating from every human being filled the air. A woman clinging for all she was worth to a seat rail at the now highest end of the car screamed out, "Please, please help me!" The car now neared a 30-degree angle. Gale had to do something. She must save her son. She'd already hugged him to her, but offered no real protection. The person seated beside them had already gotten up, thinking they were arriving at the station probably, and that left the seat empty. Gale scooted Rory and herself along the seat in bouncing movements until they were flush against the barrier. She wished they'd sat on a forward-facing double seat instead of this bench. Too late now. She tried to cover her son's face with one hand while latching her free arm around the metal pole, meant only to offer balance and aesthetics, not a handhold for a train about to, oh God, crash to the street below. Now, secured as best she could, Gale leaned down and began to whisper in Rory's ear, her voice as calm as if they were sitting on a ferry taking in the river view. She had him crushed against the barrier, determined that no matter what, she wasn't letting go. She'd cushion him if they fell, which looked more and more certain with the crazy Titanic-like angle of the car. "It's okay, baby. It's okay. This'll stop in a minute. You'll be okay. Mama's right here, and I'm not letting go, understand me? I love you. Your dad loves you, and we'll be fine." She didn't dare look at him in case he saw the terror in her eyes. If the worst thing happened, she didn't want fear being the last thing he saw on her face. Gale wished she could take a single finger and brush the flop of red hair from the face of the brave little soul. He said nothing, just clung to her like a baby monkey. In the 10 seconds since Gale had bumped them along, the floor's angle had increased, the movement gentle and methodical, as if a slow winch held the front of the train and was hauling it upward. Why they kept moving she couldn't fathom, because she could hear the brakes squealing. Some other relentless force was at play. When was this going to stop? It will not stop. This realization came in the same instant a brilliant, near-blinding flash exploded outside. Lightning was her first thought. Or the rail infrastructure collapsing? They were up so high, if they went over... No, she didn't want to think about that because she would lose her mind. Rory was the only thing filling her thoughts. Her life had no consequence, but his life mattered. If his father was no longer out there, then that left only Rory. If they both lived, somehow she would tell him everything regardless of her promise to her husband. He needed to know what he would face one day so he could prepare. She wished their family was normal, not balanced on the edge of a dangerous destiny that awaited them around every corner. Oh my God, this was terrifying. Bodies now traveling through the air, screams so horrific. Gail wanted to cover her ears, cover her son's ears. The floor slant grew ever steeper, making staying upright for those standing a near impossibility. Time slowed, everything moving as if someone had turned down the speed dial. People came tumbling out of seats, bags taking flight. An unconscious woman, her dress hiked up to her panty line, lay sprawled in the doorwell while people all around were just trying to hang on. The horrified determination there on their faces for all to witness. Clumps of people, arms and legs thrashing in a tangled mess, had slid to the end and become jammed against the interconnecting door of the car. Those on top would crush any poor soul on the bottom. There was blood, too, smeared on the floor, on seats, even on the metal rails of the seats. Oh, God, she didn't want Rory to see it, have that terrible image imprinted on his mind. The young couple across from them, whom she'd noticed kissing each other earlier, wedged themselves in their seats using their legs. An elderly woman then lay across them, her legs dangling out into the aisle. 30 seconds before, she'd stumbled past them and they'd caught her. The sound of metal, moving in positions for which it had never been intended, surrounded them, making a sound even louder than the panicked cries within. Gail had moments to think. This was happening. They were going over, and there was nothing she could do. She let go of one of her handholds and grabbed her son's arm, placing it around the railing, too. Bending her head so her lips grazed his ear, she said, "Hold on tight, darling. You can do this just like the monkey bars. Show me your superhero strength." Rory didn't answer. He seemed to be looking around the interior, but she saw his knuckles whitening with the exertion of his grasp, so she knew he'd heard her. While still up in the air at an angle in a sudden movement, the car twisted to the side. A hellish sound of cracking filled the air. This movement then flung passengers who'd been in their seats and gripping for all their life across the aisle. Those in the aisle or with no handhold skidded without ceremony across the flat expanse and smashed against seat railings and benches and other human beings. Those hit, in turn, were knocked onward like human skittles. It was like a giant shaking a container. What was up was down, and everything was chaos. In less than a breath, a business-attired man flew from one side to the other, hit a window head first, and cracked the glass with a smacking sound. Blood spurted from his injured forehead and right ear. And yet, he hadn't moved. Maybe he was fighting gravity, since that side was now downward. In the moment it took Gail to wonder how badly he'd been hurt, splintered cracks at the impact site appeared. Without warning, The window exploded with a shattering ice snap, then appeared to dissolve into the outside blackness. Moments later, the man followed. The screaming of people who'd witnessed the dreadful sight reached a high-pitched crescendo, but the sound was snatched away in an instant by the whistle and growl of the wind. A freezing gust of air blew inside, dropping the temperature as if a freezer door had opened. Gale and Rory were fortunate in that the twisting had meant they now lay on their backs. At least they wouldn't fall forward. She just had to worry about someone falling on them and knocking them loose. Across, and a few rows up, the 20-something bearded young man who'd been listening with headphones to a Walkman hung in the air, grasping the overhead rail. His headphone cord dangled between his legs, plugged into nothing. He would not stay like that for much longer, and Gale prayed he didn't fall into them. She calculated his most likely landing point would be one row up, but who knew with this unpredictable movement? If she wrapped herself around Rory, maybe she could shield him with her body, taking the force of the impact of others and the train landing in the street. Jumbled thoughts of what her husband would do crossed her mind, telling her he'd do everything to save their son and attempt anything to prepare him for the future which may come calling. Yes, that was how she'd use her last precious seconds. Gale wrapped her body around Rory as best she could, while still maintaining her grip, cuddling his head to her chest, trying to become human protective padding. She kissed his hair and marveled at his glorious red curls poking out from his beanie. She closed her eyes, imagining she and Rory were snug in her bed at home, so that despite the dreadful sounds of tearing metal and panicked human beings, she felt calm travel through her body. Gale prayed he'd understand what he must do if the time ever came, as she tiptoed through all the final words she might share with him. So many dangers, so much advice needed, so little time to deliver any of it. The only words which might make any sense, that he might remember later, slipped from her lips in a whisper into his ear. You're very special. You have a gift. Be ready. Always be ready. Her beautiful son's little hand reached from beneath the protective wall she'd made of her body and fumbled to touch her lips. I'm ready, she thought he said, hoped he'd said. You must be. Never stop being ready. Remember, you're a gift. Be kind. It was as if he understood everything when he said, Yes, Mama. If you're ready, you can. Then she changed her mind. The last thing she wanted to say to him, if it was the last, wasn't this anymore. So she said, Know that I love you for every forever. You hear me? She felt him nod and saw his little fingers tighten their grip. Gale Fine felt at peace in that instant. She'd done all she could. So when the train car twisted one last time, and when all still conscious or alive inside screamed and cried, raising the hellish chaos to another octave, she instead wore an odd look, almost one of contentment. She'd known this day might come, and here it had arrived. She had been so unprepared because she thought she'd have more time. But she had spent every appropriate moment teaching him how to be the best person he could be. Gale closed her eyes, a lone tear trickling down her cheek, and prayed she'd done enough.